But let's talk about these two keywords. Keep in mind that when we're talking about Dart programming language, pretty much all these users of Dart are using it for Flutter. And we know Flutter is pretty much designed for direct interaction from users, which means there's a lot of cases where there's going to be user input. And in development, where we know we're going to have a lot of user interaction, potentially overriding original variable names or variable values, we want to make sure that certain variables, at least the value of them, cannot be changed or updated. Now, this is such a common task that Dart actually has two methods of doing this. Let's go ahead and explore these two keywords, and then in the next lecture, I'm going to take a little bit of time to talk about static and dynamic typing. So let's head over to Dartpad and talk about constant and final. Okay, here I am in Dartpad. Let's take a look at a typical assignment so we can understand the difference between using the variable keyword versus final and constant. So if I say I have a variable called a and it's equal to 0, I can print out a as we've seen before, and what I can also do is assign it to another number, like a is now equal to 20, and then I can print out that new value of a. So let's run this. I should see as output 0 and then 20. There we go. Now, what happens if I'm in a situation where I want to make sure that no one can ever reassign the value of a to something else? For example, let's say I'm shipping a particular version of my application, and I want to make sure that no one can ever overwrite the version number because I'm referencing it somewhere else in my code. Well, let's say I have variable version is equal to 2.1. I don't want somewhere else I can accidentally do something like, actually, this was version 3.2. You'll notice that I actually am able to do that because I just use the variable assignment that we did earlier. So there's not really any protection here for the reassignment of this version variable. It started off as 2.1, got reassigned to 3.2, and then I printed out the version. If I want to make sure that this value is final and cannot be reassigned, I can use the final keyword here to say, hey, this is the final version. And you'll notice it's actually already telling us about an issue. If you show that issue, it's saying the final variable version can only be set once. So when you create a final variable, it can only be set one time. And this will produce an error. So if I run this, it says, hey, I have an error compiling because you cannot assign any sort of final variable to a different value. So here it's telling us, because I used final, you can no longer do this sort of reassignment. Okay, so another thing to note here is it can actually still be used to assign things for runtime calculations. So let me show you what I mean by that. Let's imagine I have another variable here. It's called my speed variable, and it's, variable speed, and let's say it's 100. What I could do is say, all right, my final version is equal to 2 times the value of speed, and that is okay. I can print out version, and there's actually no issues there. So let's try to understand why. I run this, and I get back 200. So the final keyword has no problem with using a runtime calculation to perform the assignment. Notice that 2 times speed is actually a calculation that needs to occur as I'm running this script. I first had to define the speed variable, then I had to multiply it, and then I can define it as version, and that's no problem. However, again, I cannot reassign version to some other value. So I can't say, okay, now version is equal to 130. You can see the error already happening. Hey, it can only be set once. Now let's imagine that instead of final, you can actually want to be even more restrictive. So there is the ability to use constant or const. So I can say const, and then let's try this again with version. Set that equal to 2.1. We can print out the version and see that that will essentially look the same. It's just going to print out 2.1. So then the question becomes, well, what's the difference between using constant? Let's try to reassign version. So I'm going to say version is now equal to 3.2. And if I run this, notice you get back an error. It's saying, hey, you're not allowed to reassign these constant variables. So you may be thinking, well, this looks a lot and it's behaving a lot like the final keyword. So the question really becomes, what is the difference between this constant keyword and this final keyword, since it looked like they were kind of doing the same thing. Well, remember when I used final, I could have used a runtime command. So I could have said variable a is equal to 10, and then, whoops, make sure we have my semicolon there, and then I can say my final variable b is equal to a times 10, and then I can print out b. So this has no issues when you do it with final. You're not technically reassigning b after you only did it one time, and you are performing what's known as a runtime calculation. This is where the difference lies. Let's try to swap out final with constant. And now when you run this, you can see it's actually already highlighting you. And the thing is, constant variables must be initialized with a constant value. It cannot do something based off a runtime calculation. So when you run this, it says, hey, I have an error trying to compile this. This technically isn't a constant expression. Why is it not constant? Because you had to be running your script in order to figure out what the value of this is. So for constant, it must be something that's constant before you would actually run the script. Basically, with that one single line of code, you know exactly what's going on. So I could do constant b is equal to, let's say, I don't know, 20 or something like that. And if you do that, then it's no longer a runtime calculation. Instead, it's a constant value. Now, why would you want to use constant instead of final? Well, remember, final can't be reassigned, and then constant is even more restrictive in the sense that you can't actually perform a runtime calculation for the constant. What you can do with constant is that if you have something that's constant that you know you shouldn't be changing later on, it actually creates very efficient variables on the back end because it essentially determines its state at compile time. That may not mean a lot to us now, but later on, as you try to make your Flutter code more efficient, the use of constants may make sense for things that you don't want the user to be able to write over or change, and constant variables that you know are always going to stay the same. So keep that in mind between final and constant. Both won't allow a user to ever overwrite that variable. Once it's defined, it can only be defined once. And then constant is even more restrictive in the sense that it has to be a constant. It can't be based off some runtime calculation. Okay, that's it. And this will lead us nicely into our very last topic of static versus dynamic. I'll see you there.